All right, last time we left off in about the year 1715 when the last major war ended, the War of the Spanish Succession, and we talked about how most of the European governments were exhausted with that war financially and in terms of manpower and all types of things economically. Um, so there's a general type of peace that sets in. There's no more gigantic European wars for the next 30 years. So we're going to pick it up at that point and talk about how European politics evolved uh, into the 1760s and how the alliances shifted, and that'll have a big effect on not just Europe but the rest of the world because of the European colonies. All right, so again, last time we left off down here at the bottom right of this display, where in 1714 a general European peace takes hold, mostly because all the major powers were military weakened and financially drained uh, at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. And the most powerful two governments had fairly unstable monarchies, and really for the same reasons. They both had regency councils that were set up because the new kings were not aware enough of how to run their own government. So a kind of takeholder government was set up for the short term. So that existed in France because the new king, Louis the 15th, is basically a child. So that regency is going to run France for a couple decades or so. And the same thing in Britain, because the British have imported basically a German king to become the new king of Britain. Um, and that king just doesn't know much about the British government. So basically, the high level politicians in Parliament are going to run Britain for the next several decades until the monarchs can, especially the next king in line, who's raised in Britain, knows enough about the government and British culture and whatnot to actually run things on some level. So the two most powerful governments, France and Britain, are on fairly unstable government monarchies at the top for several years after 1714, and that inspires them to want things to be nice and calm because wars tend to be unpredictable, and these most powerful governments want stability in order to keep their government in power to avoid any attempts at revolution or anything like that. Um, so what we really have is about 25 years up into the 1740s of general peace in Europe. There are smaller wars that occur in those years between 1714 and 1740, give or take, but those wars are usually small. There's only a couple of countries fighting, so they are not the gigantic wars that we normally talk about in these textbooks and lectures and whatnot, where all the major powers are involved, or there's some kind of big shifts in the balance of power, or there's these major alliance systems that fight each other, or something like that. So there are smaller level wars and rivalries that go on in those years, but does not explode into a continental wide conflict that could, bring in all the colonies against each other and whatnot. There are, though, three major changes in European diplomacy in these years that will have a big effect on the relationships amongst the major countries and the rivalries that develop, and how those rivalries get realigned in these years, and especially after the 1740s, that have a very dramatic effect, not just on Europe, but again, because of colonies, on the rest of the world also. So the first of these big changes is the colonies themselves. The colonies were growing in importance very, very quickly after 1714, because at this point, all the major powers have to realize that the colonies are a big moneymaker for the richest and the most powerful countries, especially Britain and France. So, especially as Britain is taking a lot of wealth out of North America, not just through stealing gold like the Spanish Empire had been doing in the Americas for hundreds of years by this point, since the early 1500s, but the British colonies are built to be more commercial colonies. So they build cities there, they import and export things, and the government taxes that stuff. And the British government was making huge amounts of money, especially in the so-called 13 colonies in northeastern North America. So the original 13 colonies that will eventually create the United States. So that was a major source of wealth. And the colonies in India, in South Asia, were also extremely profitable for Britain and France. There's a rivalry there. So there's British and French colonies in India. The Spanish still have a large empire in what we today call basically Latin America, parts of North America, the Caribbean islands, and large chunks of South America. The Portuguese also have a large South American colony in Brazil. They also have colonies around Africa. And there's also the Southeast Asian islands, what were back then the Europeans called these the East Indies. So the Europeans have colonies all over the world, and those colonies are growing in wealth. And because they're becoming more a center of wealth, a center of profit for the home countries in Europe itself, they become much more politically important about who's going to control what colony. So they will fight wars purely over colonies eventually. So the most important of these colonies, the wealthiest ones, are really the ones in the Caribbean, because these are fairly small land-wise territories, territorial colonies. They're just much smaller than like all the 13 colonies in North America that the British own. So these Caribbean islands are comparatively small, but they generate massive amounts of profit, largely because of sugar and molasses that are grown there. So these colonial economies in the Caribbean are almost entirely dependent on slavery, largely Africans that are kidnapped from Africa and brought to the Caribbean and enslaved and forced to work. And sugar and molasses and those products' contributions to things like rum are massively popular in Europe and around the world. So they are a major moneymaker for whichever European powers control those colonies. So the biggest colony is Cuba, and that's Spanish owned. This is a fairly old map by the time we get into the 1700s. The next big island is called Hispaniola. That was the Spanish name for it. By the 1700s, it's been broken in half, so that the French control a western half of that island in their colony that they call Saint-Domingue, and the Spanish still control the eastern half that they call Santo Domingo. So, and then there's all these other smaller islands that kind of break out eastward from there. And also a lot of the South American colonies, especially Brazil, are heavily dependent on slavery. And they are also growing things like sugar and producing molasses and rum. So these colonies, especially in the Caribbean, are so massively profitable that the Europeans fight each other, and this leads to diplomacy and negotiations to buy colonies from each other and whatnot. And even open warfare, especially when the colonial interest and the ships that are going back and forth across the ocean bump into each other, and they know that they're at least business rivals, if not military rivals, and sometimes they just attack each other. So, and with so many ships sailing around the oceans with so much money, there's a large problem of piracy out in the area. Pirates will attack an individual ship, and if they defeat the crew on that ship, they usually kill or kidnap the crew, and they just steal all the goods or the money that's on board the ship, and try to find a small island or somewhere to hole up and hide. So that's where you often get the Pirates of the Caribbean type of idea. So the colonies are massively important and growing even more important as the 1700s go on. And any of the European countries that are looking to make more money through mercantilism, this kind of taxing the trade that's going on, are going to look to establish colonies or grow their colonies or attack their rivals' colonies. because if your enemy has a lot of colonies that your enemy is making a lot of money off of, you might be afraid that they might eventually use that money to build up a huge military and attack you as a country and conquer your whole country. So it's not just a rivalry that you don't like somebody else, but you're actively afraid of them and the wealth and power that they're building up that might be used against you at some point. All right, the next big evolution in European politics is what's going on with the Holy Roman Empire. Largely the leader of Austria and a lot of these other little German principalities and smaller governments that often proclaim allegiance to the leader of Austria, who is almost by default always the Holy Roman Emperor. The problem is that the current emperor who rose to the throne in 1711, as he grows older, he doesn't have any sons, so he doesn't have any male heirs to his throne. And he's fairly obsessed as he gets into his later years about who in his family is going to take over for him on the throne. So he has a daughter that seems very smart and trustworthy named Maria Theresa. But there is also another possibility. A daughter of a former emperor is also around, and there's a kind of political group in Austria and amongst other Germans that are claiming that that other person should be the heir to the throne. So because they're both women, there's this kind of everything's up in the air basically about which of these two women is going to be the next leader. So the thing that Charles VI does is create what he calls the pragmatic sanction that specifies that Maria Theresa should be the formal heir to the throne, so that when Charles dies, that she will become empress. She will be the next Holy Roman Empire leader and also the Austria government's leader. And Charles will basically spend the rest of his life on tour, going around to the different European capital cities and trying to get all the major European leaders and governments to sign on to this agreement, to agree to allow Maria Theresa to ascend to the Austrian and therefore the Holy Roman Empire leadership. So that's one big thing that's going to kind of realign a lot of European politics. Was some leaders sign on to it, most leaders sign on to it, most governments do, some don't, some hold out, and that'll become a kind of large problem going into the future. The third big thing to note in this kind of early to mid 1700s that's changing is the rise of a country called Prussia as a major military force, so-called great power. And Prussia on this map is these areas in yellow. So Prussia is one of these many hundreds of different little German governments and principalities and duchies and all these things that you see in the kind of darkened area on this map. So that's like the German realm. And Prussia starts off as just kind of one of those 200 or so different little governments. But over time, especially since about the mid-1600s, the Prussian leaders and governments have figured out how to consolidate their power, buy up new land, or even invade other land, or form marriage alliances or something to keep growing the size of Little Prussia into what we see on this map highlighted in yellow. And here's another type of depiction of this on this map. Again, the German realm is kind of highlighted with this the red border around it on this map. And Prussia on this map is growing and growing bit by bit over about 100 years until the 1740s. They're in the orange area on this map now. So they had reorganized their military to make it more efficient, to put a lot of emphasis on training their soldiers and streamlining their government bureaucracy, their administration of all these different diverse areas that come under their control. So it starts off as one small area that forms an alliance with another area and buys land and does all these things step by step over about 100 years until you get to about the mid-1700s, when by about the 1730s The Prussian military is actually extremely efficient. It tends to be larger than any other German government. They have more land mostly than any other German government, but they're also dedicating a huge amount of their government budget to military spending to build up the Prussian army and train them to be one of the most effective fighting forces in Europe, if not the whole world. So the Prussian government is spending something like 70% of its state budget, its government income, on its own military. So they are building, building, building. They're investing in the newest and best military technology, and they're constantly training their soldiers, getting ready for some type of conflict, because they're afraid that as they are growing, that will anger other countries, especially Austria. Down here in the kind of bottom right on this map, this yellowish area, that if Prussia keeps growing, that will make Austria afraid, so Austria might launch a preemptive strike basically at some point. And with this map, Britain and France have already been long-term rivals. They've already fought wars against each other, especially in the colonies, for many, many years. So Britain and France, they are still rivals at this point. They still don't like each other, and they still don't trust each other. And France figures that Austria is the biggest threat to France in the long term. The French leaders are worried about still the future possibility of Austria and Spain uniting somehow in an alliance, if not a formal monarchy that would go against the previous peace treaty in 1714. But France is still afraid of that. So France figures that the best way to protect themselves is to hurt Austria. So the French leaders figure the best way to do that is to support Prussia in its growth, to threaten Austria. So France and Prussia will increasingly become friends until about 1740. And out of fear of that, Austria will eventually become friends with Britain, because Britain is a rival of France. So we'll see all this kind of mapped out in a kind of flow chart of ideas in a little bit. So it's a little confusing to talk about just while looking at a map, but we'll see how it works out in a couple slides. So by 1740, there is a new king who rises to the throne of Prussia, and his name is Frederick II. So this picture of him is from much later. He's on his throne for 45 years. So this portrait of him is made in his later years. But in 1740, he's a fairly young, ambitious, and kind of hot-headed type of guy. So he ascends to the throne of Prussia right when Charles dies in Austria, and Maria Theresa becomes the new empress in 1740. And the thing is that Frederick II was not the previous, he had just become king of Prussia. So the previous Prussian king had signed on to the Pragmatic Sanction, which would recognize Maria Theresa as the Austrian Holy Roman Empire leader. But Frederick II had never signed that. And he sees this as an opportunity. So he thinks that now there's this woman on the throne of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, and there's also a rival in Austria that might be still able to make claims to that throne. So there might be some internal divisions within Austria about who their leader should actually be. And Frederick II figures, with a weakened enemy and a very powerful military on his side, that he's going to launch a surprise invasion of an area called Silesia, which is here in yellow on this map, in order to conquer that place before the Austrians can get their act together and defend it. So he does this in December of 1740. He launches basically a surprise attack. He lines up his troops on the border of, on this map, kind of in the Brandenburg area. So everything in green and blue is part of the Prussian Empire at 1740 when he gets to the throne, and he launches his attack kind of directly southeast into this Silesia area. So why does he target that place? Well, because it has a large population and it has a large wealthy population. So there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of investors, big landowners, wealthy people. and he figures this is a really valuable territory to control. So if he gets control of it, which he does through this invasion, this effectively doubles Prussia's population entirely, doubles its kind of industrial and merchant base, part of its economy, and doubles its tax revenue by conquering this one territory. So Frederick sees this as a great opportunity, and he launches an invasion, conquers the place outright. And his next kind of goal is really just to control it. So he keeps his troops there, puts it under occupation, says he's going to bring that area into the Prussian governance, and does that over the next couple years. And he has to keep his troops there because Austria is going to counterattack to try to kick his troops out. So his big goal for the next couple years or so, until a peace treaty kind of is created between Prussia and Austria in 1742, is to just defend it and keep it. And that peace treaty does keep Silesia as part of Prussia for the long term. The problem, though, is that when that war broke out, that leads to bigger fighting in what becomes known as the War of the Austrian Succession. And this is where the major allies just start going at each other. So this is where we see on this chart, Prussia and France are in an alliance, mostly because they're both angry and afraid and see a possibility to take advantage of Austria. Austria is basically desperate for allies as this conflict breaks out, so they sign an alliance with Britain to fight this war. So the major rivalries are really in this war are Prussia versus Austria and France versus Britain. Those are the kind of things that are holding this system together. So the major war breaks out in 1741 as Austria starts fighting against Prussia, and once they attack Prussia, then France comes into the war and Britain comes into the war, and eventually Spain even gets into it. So the Austrian government is losing ground for the first year of the war, the major war, in by the end of 1741. But in 1742, they start fighting back much more successfully as they enlarge the size of their army. And the French have invaded parts of Austria, and the Austrians kicked them out by the end of 1744. And the Austrians are feeling so ambitious at that point that they think about attacking to take Silesia back. And so that brings Frederick back into the war to defend Silesia against an Austrian counterattack again. The British policy is basically to send money to Austria to keep them fighting. The British like the fact that this war is going on because the British are going to go out and conquer a huge amount of colonies around the world, especially from France. So the British mostly just take advantage of this war happening in Europe in order to fight the war in other places that they think are valuable, especially the kind of sugar islands in the Caribbean, places in India. So the British, they don't even send that many troops to Europe to fight. They send all their troops around the world to conquer colonies, and their policy is basically to send money and supplies to Austria just to keep the war going so that they still have this opportunity to continue taking colonies. So by about 1746, most of the major powers, they've spent a bunch of money on this, so they're starting to go broke. Some countries like Austria and Prussia are now starting to get very afraid of being directly militarily invaded. So there's very quickly a negotiation to establish a peace treaty starting in 1746. And because this war is so complex and the British want to keep fighting, really, the peace negotiations drag out for a couple years and is finalized in 1748 in this, what we call a Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. So the major result of the treaty is that Frederick II of Prussia gets to keep Silesia, but Maria Theresa, she signs off on this, but she keeps making public statements about how much of a snake Frederick II is and how it's like her mission in life to take back Silesia, and she's going to try to figure out how to accomplish that for a long time. Britain is forced, or at least convinced, to return most of the colonies that they had conquered during the war. They keep a couple, but most of the colonies are returned to the kind of pre-war status quo. And another obvious result is that the Austrians hate and distrust Britain because they feel very used during the war. That the British didn't really care about Austria, they just see them as useful to keep the war going. So the Austrians had always been asking for more supplies, more help during the war, and the British really just sent enough to keep Austria alive during the war, to keep them fighting, to keep the war going. So the Austrian government feels very used by Britain, and feels like Britain is really a bunch of greedy liars that are only in the war for themselves. They don't really care anything about Austria being attacked or destroyed or whatever. So they feel like they've been used as a decoy during this conflict, and they're very angry at that. And that anger will contribute to what we call the diplomatic revolution that will happen in mostly the 1750s, early 1750s. So going into this next section, Maria Theresa, as the leader of Austria, is very angry at this previous war and immediately starts making plans for a new war to attack, not just to take back Silesia, but to attack Prussia in general and destroy it, and take some land from it, but mostly to go after Frederick II, knock him out of power, maybe have him executed or whatever. But that's generally what the Austrian government wants to do. They're extremely angry at this, so it's not just her. This feeling kind of permeates throughout her entire administration and the entire bureaucracy. So the government is very much on board with this. So they start doing all kinds of things internally, really copying a lot of things that the Prussian government had been doing for about the past 100 years, reforming their tax structure in order to boost their tax revenue, trying to break down local government control over tax collection, all kinds of different things, in order to bring them more fully under the control of the central government, which is another thing that Prussia had been doing for a long time. Trying to create a single kind of government for the whole area, kind of administration that would be streamlined and can collect money, build up a large military, train them extremely well, supply them extremely well, and get ready for the next war. There's also, though, her head of foreign policy named Count Kaunitz, who likes that all this is going on to strengthen Austria internally, but he also wants to strengthen Austria externally. So he makes an argument to the high levels of the Austrian government that when this war starts, that Austria should not keep Britain as an ally, because there's a lot of agreement within Austria that Britain had really just used them in the previous war. So the idea is to look around for a new alliance system that can be built up to attack Prussia reliably and destroy it. And Kaunitz argues that Britain is not reliable enough to be involved in that project, so they're not dependable. So Kaunitz argues that he uses this kind of an Enlightenment type of argument, saying that just the rivalry system that we have going, especially this rivalry that's been going on for a long time between France and Austria, doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. Because Britain is basically a kind of enemy of Austria now, and France is an enemy of Britain. So Kaunitz argues that Austria should make friends with France and form an alliance with France, because they have a lot of kind of mutual interests in Europe and around the world. So he says this long-term hostility with France is really pretty meaningless. France doesn't have anything to fear from Austria, and the Spanish Empire is kind of falling apart. So Spain is not nearly as powerful as they had been in the 1500s, when they're a much bigger threat to France. So France is, at this point, not really afraid so much anymore of Spain and Austria creating some kind of alliance to destroy France. So France is much more open to a friendship with Austria because it has so little to fear from Spain at this point. And I know this is all confusing, but it's kind of soap opera dramatic type of stuff. And the French government really felt the same way about Prussia during the last war, that Prussia had used France so that Prussia could attack specific areas that Prussia wanted to control, like Silesia and others, and that France was just a decoy to help Prussia accomplish that. So France is feeling the same way about Prussia as Austria is feeling about Britain. It's just distrust. So, that mutual distrust against their former allies brings France and Austria together into a new alliance. So Kaunitz signs a treaty, a foreign policy treaty with France to form this alliance. And their goal is really to attack Prussia at the same time, to destroy it. And Kaunitz also signs up Russia to this alliance with the basic deal that Austria, France, and Russia would all attack Prussia at the same time in order to destroy it, and then they'll split up the land amongst themselves, and each of the three partners will get some land, and eventually Sweden even signs on to this to attack from the north. So Prussia is in a really difficult situation, and we'll take a look at a map in a minute of this. So in the previous war, the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s, we saw this alliance between a partnership between Prussia and France versus Austria and Britain. And things changed quite dramatically to the new alliance system, where basically Austria and Prussia have switched sides on it. So Austria is going to now be aligned with France and Russia, and their project is to all simultaneously attack Prussia to destroy Prussia and again divide Prussian territory amongst themselves. And Prussia is now so desperate for anyone to help them take on these three major powers that Prussia will sign an alliance with Britain. So Britain was really left out of these negotiations because nobody really trusts Britain, but Prussia is now so desperate for any help because their survival is at stake that they'll sign this alliance with Britain. And these are the major allies that are going to fight the next giant conflict that historians will call the 7 Years' War, because it lasts 7 years eventually. So the major alliance system that we're going to have here is still reflective of the colonial rivalries between France and Britain and the continuing rivalry between Austria and Prussia. It's just that those two hatreds kind of get realigned a little bit, and this is what it's going to look like on the map. So we see France in the west in blue, Austria to the south in blue, and Russia to the far east on this map in blue. And also eventually Sweden's going to join this. So all these countries in blue are all going to attack Prussia in the middle at the same time, hoping to destroy Prussia, destroy its government, and divide up the territory amongst themselves. And again, Prussia is so desperate for help because they're being attacked literally on all sides at the same time by most of the major powers of Europe, that they will sign up Britain, which is still on this map called England, in an alliance just in order to survive it. But we also have to realize that this war is going to go international because especially the British and French empires are span across the entire world. So the fighting actually breaks out in the North American colonies. And a few things to kind of realize about the colonies, what's kind of going on in the 1750s. Britain and France and Spain have quite a lot of colonies in North America. So the kind of whitish area are the so-called 13 British colonies, and they go up to a mountain range called the Appalachian Mountains, and that's the generally recognized border of the British colonies. And there's a large colony up in the north in what we today call Canada, which on this map is called New France. So that's a French colony. And the French also control a colony down in New Orleans, at the bottom of the Mississippi River. And the French also have little towns and settlements up along the Mississippi River and even the Ohio River. So those are called the Louisiana colonies, basically. And the French government's policy, their plan, is to unite all of those little towns and colonies into one major kind of colonial system because they're not very heavily populated. They're kind of sparse. They're far away from each other. So France's project to try to control the North American continent to some extent is to unite those colonies together in like a single administrative system. The Spanish don't have a whole lot to say about that because Spain controls Florida on this map. You can see the kind of greenish area. And Spain also controls what is today Mexico and going up into like Texas and kind of further west from the Mississippi. Though that's all their colony in what they called New Spain. So the Spanish are on the periphery of this, but the major conflict is going to happen when France is trying to unite all those colonies along those river systems. But the 13 British colonies in white on this map are steadily moving further and further west because they're getting overpopulated. They have so many people and they're so prosperous that they're looking for more land. So they're expanding consistently further and further west. And as they do that, they're conquering land and pushing native groups further and further west outward to the point that eventually those natives, the British settlers, and the French colonies are now coming into conflict along the rivers. And that's going to spark an attack by a young British colonel who's pretty impetuous and thinks he's going for glory, and he's going to open up the Trans Mountain Range area to British colonization, and this is going to be a great glorious thing. He's going to get rich and famous off all this stuff. So this young colonel leads an attack against a French fort called Fort Duquesne on this map where you see the arrow pointing right to. So that's a French defensive position, and this young British colonel in the colonial militia leads an attack against that fort in 1754. The French win that battle, so the young colonel is defeated and humiliated, and has to sign a treaty even giving land to the French. So that turned out to be a miserable failure, and that guy is humiliated for a while until he gets involved in another series of events. And that guy's name is George Washington. So that's the first time that he really comes to prominence among the 13 colonies. And but that attack, though, precipitated a larger war. It basically convinced these colonies, in these French and British colonies, to start fighting each other. And so a general colonial war will begin in 1755. And that war amongst these colonies will kind of pull their home governments, France and Britain, general that will break out colonies, and that war will kind of pull in their allies, Austria and Prussia and Russia, to start the European-wide war the next year in 1756. So the so-called 7 Years' War actually breaks out and starts in what is today Pittsburgh. This Fort Duquesne is now Pittsburgh. That's where this gigantic war starts, and it will span the entire world and have huge ramifications for European and world history. So what's happening in Europe when all this breaks out? So the leader of Prussia, Frederick II, decides that the last time, his last policy to start the previous war was pretty successful, launch a preemptive strike and take over some land. So he does that again into a place called Saxony, which is actually a little bit to the west of Silesia. This area here on the map is Silesia, so Prussia has control of that. So they invade an area to the west under the same policy. Let's gain a whole bunch of land, we'll gain a whole bunch of tax revenue and build up our military there, and we'll use that as the fighting ground against Austria and France. So the Prussian government is very aware of France, and Austria has formed this alliance to invade and basically kill Prussia and divide up their territory. So Frederick invades Saxony in order to use that as the best fighting territory to fight this war. And now that the war is on, the Russians attack from the east. So they attack into what is known as East Prussia. The French armies begin moving eastward from France, going kind of northeast up toward Prussia, up toward Saxony to launch their attack. And the Austrians attack northward into Saxony pretty much immediately. So Prussia is under invasion from different countries in 3 different spots all at the same time. The problem, though, is that these allies, France, Austria, and Russia, they don't really communicate with each other very well, so they don't have like a very well-planned battle strategy for what they're going to do, and they're mostly attacking to get land for themselves after they figure Prussia has been defeated. So they're all going after the most valuable territories that they want for themselves in the future, rather than any kind of real military strategy to actually win this war. So these 3 allies, they don't communicate with each other, they don't coordinate with each other, and that's a kind of gigantic problem that they're going to have. And Frederick is the king of Prussia. He has the military solidly under his control, and his troops are much better trained and much better supplied than any of his enemies. And again, he's being attacked in 3 different areas at the same time, but he doesn't have to move his troops around very far to meet those attacks and to defend against those attacks. So he and his generals have much shorter lines of communication, of internal movement and supply movement. And so over time, over the next several years, they actually defeat all these invasions one after another. So for Frederick and the Prussians, it's kind of like the whack-a-mole game, where an invasion pops up in one place, so they send their army out there and knock it down, and an invasion pops up in another place, they send their army there, knock it down, and this keeps going on really chaotically for about 7 years, until there's a peace treaty signed in 1763, largely because the king of Russia at that point died in 1762, so the new monarch didn't want this war and pulled Russia out of the war. The French are, by the early 1760s, are losing battles in the colonies, so they are only sending a few troops and a little bit of money to fight this war in Europe itself, because they think they have bigger problem than the rest of the world. And so Austria was really left alone to run this invasion, and Austria's military just was not nearly as good as the Prussian military. So the results of this 1763 treaty that is known as the Peace of Paris, that ends the war, specifically to be talking about the war in Europe, is that Prussia gets to keep Silesia for the long term. Prussia has to give back Saxony, this place it invaded in 56 when the war broke out. But Prussia survives against this 3-pronged military assault on all sides against it. And from this point forward, people start calling Frederick the Great, because he was great at defending the country against a series of major invasions all at the same time. So he and his generals are seen as like the military geniuses of their time, and the French, or the Prussian military, is seen as the greatest military relative to its size and budget and all that, the most powerful fighting force in the world. And other countries will start to see how the Prussians had built their military in the 1700s, and will start to emulate that going forward into the late 1700s and 1800s. So now going to the colonial war, starting off with the war in North America, the French had formed a whole lot of alliances with Native American groups, mostly because these Native Americans were really angry at the British for pushing them out of their lands. So the French signed allies, Native American allies, to fight against the British. So in the North American colonies, the 13 colonies, the British colonies, the British colonists call this the French and Indian War, because they're fighting against French and natives. So that is the terminology that goes into U.S. history textbooks, because that's what the British colonies called it. Almost all European and other worldwide textbooks call this larger worldwide conflict the 7 Years' War. So the French and their native allies, when the war broke out in 1755, actually won almost all the early battles for the first couple of years in this war. And the big change that starts to happen is actually the British Navy will start to more mobilize fully to fight an international war. But the big thing that happens is that some British elections changed the political party in power in 1757 in June. So a new prime minister comes into office. His name is William Pitt. And he has a much larger vision of the war. And it's really to basically do the same policy that had worked so well for Britain in the previous war. Send a bunch of money to its European ally, at this point Prussia, to keep the war going, and use the war as an opportunity to do a much, much larger ramp up of the British Navy, and use that Navy to attack especially French colonies all over the world and take control over them one way or the other. So Pitt's policy is going to become extremely successful. It takes about a year and a half to really ramp up the British Navy, but they start a huge series of attacks, especially in India, which is in South Asia. So by 1762, there's a series of giant battles between the French and British colonists in India that the British eventually win. So by 1762, they have completely controlled India and kicked the French out, and the peace treaty the next year will basically declare all of India to be a formal British colony, and Britain will keep that colony for almost 200 years into the mid-1900s, and India will be a huge source of wealth and power for India, not just in South Asia, but they'll try to use that power to influence China and other areas in East Asia for hundreds of years. There are also a giant series of battles going on in North America still, and by 1758-59 we start to see the British attacking the French colonies, especially in what we today call Canada, starting in the kind of top right of this map. In 1758 they attack Louisbourg, which was a kind of outlying French colony, and once they kind of conquer that, they start moving down, you can see by this red arrow, down the St. Lawrence River, and one after another start attacking French colonies down the river. So they conquer Quebec, which was the colonial capital of the French colonies in all of what we today call Canada. So they take the capital city in 59, then in 60 they move into Montreal, and they just continue moving down the river, and there's not much that the French can do to stop it, because they can't get any supplies anymore because the British control the river. The British also start attacking some French colonies in the Caribbean, going after those big sugar slavery islands in 1759, and start gaining a lot of success in that. And that scares Spain so much by 1760 that Spain decides to enter the war in 1762 because they're afraid that Britain is basically taking over the American colonies. So Spain gets into the war to kind of defend its own colonies in Latin America, which is a gigantic mistake because Britain immediately launches an invasion of Cuba in 1762, and then Manila in the Philippines in Southeast Asia. And so Spain's involvement in this war is just absolutely catastrophic. They lose almost every battle they fight against Britain. So by the time we get a peace treaty in 1763 called the Peace of Paris, Spain is going to have to give over a whole lot of all kinds of territory, and France also, to Britain, especially in the colonies. So in the Peace of Paris in 1763, Spain gives all of Florida to Britain. So Britain now controls Florida as a colony. France gives all of the Louisiana colonies to Spain in order to pay off Spain so that Spain will give Florida to Britain. Britain wanted Florida much more than the Louisiana area, the Louisiana River, the Mississippi River. But at the same time, France also gives all of Canada and the Nova Scotia area, the kind of eastern part of the colony at Canada, to Britain. So at this point in 63, Canada becomes a completely British colony. The French monarchy, the French government, is basically bankrupted in this war. France has been humiliated in this war, except for the first few battles in North America for a couple years. They basically lose control over everything else. They accomplish none of their goals in Europe or India or anywhere else around the world. So the French monarchy is bankrupted in this war and completely humiliated. They've given up huge amounts of land, especially in North America and India, in order just to get the war to stop. So this is especially a massive success for Britain in gaining control over all these colonies around the world. And at that point, Britain launches itself as really the undisputed most powerful country in the world. Prussia basically survives this war. That's the big accomplishment for Prussia in this thing. They don't really gain any new land out of it, but they avoid being conquered. So the biggest results that we see are the change in colonies, really. India becomes a fully British empire, a full British colony, and especially the changes in North America. So we see this panel on the left, the picture on the left, showing what the North American colonies looked like and who owned them before the war started in 1756. So green is the Spanish Empire, so you see that they own Florida. France owns this kind of tannish type color, this yellowish, somethingish, orangish kind of color, I guess. So you see that they control most of what we today call Canada and a huge amount of territory around the Mississippi River. And the British colonies are really just along the seaboard, the 13 so-called colonies of the British Empire in North America, which are along the eastern coastline. But in 1763, we see a massive amount of change. So basically, France is kicked out of the equation completely. So Britain takes over all of the French colonies in Canada, and Britain also takes over all of the former French colonial land between that mountain range where the original colonies end, going up to the Mississippi River. So the British colonists have a lot of new land they can move westward into, up to the Mississippi River. Britain also takes over Florida from Spain, and in order to convince Spain to accept that, France had to pay off Spain by basically giving them all of the land of the Louisiana territory west of the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River is the dividing line for the colonies after 1763, between Britain to the east and Spain to the west. And France is really pretty much just kind of kicked out of the continent almost entirely. So France gives up a huge amount of territory, colonial territory in North America and India. France will retain its colony, not shown very well on this map, in the western part of Hispaniola, and Spain will get back its colony in Cuba. And Spain will keep its colony at Santo Domingo, the eastern half of the Hispaniola island. But this war is a huge paradigm-changing thing, not just for Europe, but especially out in the colonies. And the British spent so much money to fight this war and gain all this territory and all this land and all this power that the British government is actually pretty heavily in debt when this war ends in 1763. And the British government will figure that since they gained all this land and opened all this land to their colonies, especially in North America, that the colonists should help pay for that success, that they're going to have to pay higher tax rates, basically, to help the British government pay down that national debt that they had taken on to to conquer these colonies in the first place. So the British colonies all around the world are going to see their tax rates increase, often very slightly, in order to pay for having fought this conflict and won and gained access to all this extra land. And the British themselves, the people living in Britain, agree to also pay a tax increase in order to pay down the national debt. So that will lead pretty directly to the American Revolution, which starts off as a complaint about taxes and whatnot. So that's another way that this war will have a gigantic long-term effect. And we'll get into that effect and the American Revolution and how France's involvement in the American Revolution leads to the French Revolution, and all these dominoes start to get kind of lined up, and they start to fall. And we'll see that in future lectures. And another really important thing to note about all this is that this is a big change in human experience, especially with warfare. What we've seen in warfare ever since ancient times, up until the period covered in this lecture, is that certain governments go to war with each other in specific areas of the globe, and they fight against each other in their kind of little region, and that's about it. As we start to see getting into the 1500s, because the Europeans have different colonies in different parts of the world, when England or France goes to war against each other, a couple of their colonies may fight somewhere in like North America or some other place, but it's only confined to one, maybe two, maybe three regions of the world. But what we have by 1763 is a whole different experience, where a conflict that starts out between Prussia and its neighbors, or between the British and French colonists in North America, those conflicts start off in those localized places, but they quickly grow to encompass the entire globe. So there's fighting in many different regions all at the same time, which are basically the same conflicts, because these European countries that start the conflict in Europe, they have these far-flung empires that span the entire globe. So they literally bring the whole world into war, or at least a massive amount of the human population into these wars. A far larger proportion of the human population all fight in the same conflict than anything we've ever seen before. So many historians point at this era as what they call the advent of so-called world war, a worldwide conflict that's going on in many, many places all at the same time, that's based in the same kind of rivalries. So this is a whole paradigm change in the human experience, where even today we have so many alliances across the globe of different countries that any one small localized conflict can quickly kind of spread out of control and create a worldwide conflict.